Chapter 1. The Setup. Daniel Voss had not touched a chessboard in 11 years, and yet he still saw the world in 64 squares. The bar was dim, the kind of dim that cost extra. He counted exits without meaning to. One behind the bar, one through the kitchen, a fire door propped with a mop bucket that nobody had noticed but him. Old habits. Older instincts. His father used to say a chess player never really stops playing, he just changes what the board is made of. Across the room, a man named Elias Rourke was buying a stranger a drink he didn't need, laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny, and touching his own collar every 90 seconds like a tell he didn't know he had. Rourke owned 4 casinos, a shipping company that moved more than cargo, and, 12 years ago, a construction firm that had cut every corner on an apartment complex in the East End. Daniel's father had been the site inspector who signed off on it. The building still stood. It was the inspector's name that hadn't survived the lawsuit that followed the fire. "You're staring," said a voice at Daniel's shoulder. He didn't turn. He knew the voice, knew it the way you know a hand that's been on the back of your neck for a year. The bishop never announced himself. He simply arrived, like check. "I'm working," Daniel said. "You're grieving with better posture." The bishop slid onto the stool beside him, a compact man in an unremarkable grey suit, the kind of face that left a room and was immediately hard to describe. "Rourke likes chess." "Did I mention that?" "Charity tournament next month, black tie, $10,000 buy-in for a seat at his table. He fancies himself an aggressive player. Sacrifices too early. Wants to be feared more than he wants to win. You want me to hustle him at chess? I want you to become the only person in his world he can't read. Everything after that is arithmetic." Daniel finally looked at him. "And what's my arithmetic? What do I get?" Chapter 2. The Setup. The bishop smiled, and it was, as always, a completely convincing smile. The truth about the fire. Rourke's own files. "I'll have them the week the tournament ends." That's not an answer. That's bait. Everything is bait, Daniel. The only question that ever matters is whether you're the one holding the rod or the one on the hook. The bishop stood, straightened a cuff that didn't need straightening. "Learn the board again. You have 3 weeks." He was gone before Daniel could answer, the way he was always gone. Not dramatically, just efficiently, like a piece lifted off the board between one blink and the next. Daniel sat with his drink going warm and did the thing he had trained himself for 11 years not to do. He pictured a board. White king, black king, and everything in between reduced to force and geometry. He hated how easily it still came. He hated more how good it felt. Somewhere in the back of his skull, quiet as a held breath, something that was not quite a memory said, "There it is. Welcome back." He told himself it was nothing. He had gotten very good, over 11 years, at telling himself things. Chapter 3. The mark. Rourke's penthouse office had a chessboard in it, a showpiece, ivory and ebony, pieces never moved, dust in the grooves. Daniel noticed that first. A man who owned a board like a trophy and not like a weapon. He'd gotten the introduction the way the bishop always arranged introductions, sideways, deniable, seemingly accidental. A mutual acquaintance at a gallery opening. A comment about the Sicilian defense that Rourke overheard and couldn't resist correcting badly. Within a week, Daniel Voss, investment consultant, recently relocated, mildly, tastefully wealthy, had been invited to dinner. "You play?" Rourke asked, nodding at the board like it was an old friend rather than furniture. "I used to," Daniel said. "True." The truest thing he'd say all night. Used to. Everybody used to. Nobody has the patience anymore. Rourke poured 2 glasses of something old and unnecessarily expensive. "Chess is the last honest game left. No luck. No hiding. Just who sees further?" Daniel thought of the fire inspector's report his father had refused to falsify, and a second report, filed a week later under his father's forged signature, that said the opposite. He thought of his father's name in a newspaper, then in a settlement, then nowhere at all. He smiled the way the bishop smiled, the useful smile, the one with nothing behind it that could be read. Funny, Daniel said. I always thought chess was the most honest way to lie to somebody. Rourke laughed, delighted. Say more. Every move tells the truth about where the piece is. It just doesn't tell the truth about why you moved it. Something shifted behind Rourke's eyes. Interest. Maybe respect. Maybe the first click of a much larger trap setting itself. The tournament next month. You should play. I'd like to see what you do with a real board. I'd like that too, Daniel said, and meant it in a way that frightened him slightly, because for one full second the calculation and the desire were the same feeling, and he could not tell them apart. Chapter 4. The Mark. Driving home, he replayed the dinner move by move, the way he used to replay games as a boy, lying on his bedroom floor with a pocket set. Every sentence he'd said had been chosen. Every laugh had been placed. He was good at this. He had always been good at this, first at 64 squares and now at something with no board at all, and the thought did not comfort him the way it once had. Quiet, in the dark of the car, the voice came again, cleaner this time. Steadier. He respects force. Give him force he can respect, and he'll hand you the game without knowing he lost it. Daniel gripped the wheel. I didn't ask you, he said out loud, to no one, in an empty car, and was more disturbed by the fact that he'd answered than by the fact that something had spoken. Chapter 5. The Bishop's Game. The bishop's real name, if he had one, was not a thing Daniel had ever been permitted to know. 9 years ago he had found Daniel at his absolute lowest, 3 weeks off a bender, 4 months off a job, and a very long way off the boy who had once been ranked in the top 100 of his age bracket nationally before his father's disgrace, made the family name radioactive in every club, school, and tournament hall in the state. You have a rare talent, the bishop had said then, in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee. You see 3 moves further than the room. The problem is you've only ever used it on a board. The whole world is a board, Daniel. It's just that most people never learn the rules. It should have sounded insane. Instead, it had sounded like the first true thing anyone had said to him in a year. Now, 3 weeks from the tournament, they met in a parking garage that smelled like concrete and rain, and the bishop laid it out with the calm of a man discussing weather. Rourke keeps his real books off-site, but there's a partial ledger on a private server that only unlocks during the tournament, some vanity security theatre, biometric, tied to a device he wears at the table. You're not there to beat him at chess, Daniel. You're there to get close enough, long enough, that a very small, very quiet piece of software can do its work while you keep his eyes on the board. And the files on my father are part of that ledger. One document among thousands. I've seen the index. I have not seen the document. That would defeat the purpose of needing you. The bishop's eyes, when they held Daniel's, gave away exactly nothing, which was itself a kind of honesty. He had never pretended to be anything but unreadable. You get him to trust your mind before you get him to trust your hand. That's the whole architecture. You've been building this for years. I've been building this since before you knew my face. A pause, textured, deliberate. You're not the first piece I've moved onto this square, Daniel. You are, I'll admit, the most interesting. Chapter 6. The Bishop's Game. Daniel felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the parking garage's bad ventilation. Meaning what? Meaning ask better questions if you want better answers. The bishop checked a watch that was, like everything about him, correct to the second. Learn the board. I'll be in touch. Walking to his car, Daniel became aware of how easily he had accepted a plan built by a man who had just admitted, almost cheerfully, that Daniel was neither the first nor necessarily the last piece in this particular game. He became aware, too, of how little that admission had actually bothered him, and that the not being bothered him more than anything else that night. You noticed that, the voice said, with something that in a person might have been approval. Good. That's the part of you I need awake. Chapter 7. Opening moves. For 3 weeks, Daniel rebuilt the machinery he'd spent a decade dismantling. He played online at 4 in the morning against strangers whose ratings meant nothing, just to feel his calculation come back online, rusty gears finding their grooves. He studied Rourke's 5 publicly recorded tournament games from a decade ago, amateur events, charity nonsense, but a player's habits under low stakes were often more honest than under high ones. Rourke attacked when nervous. He castled early, almost defensively, then threw everything forward the moment he felt safe. A man who needed to feel secure before he could be reckless. That told Daniel more about Rourke than any dossier the bishop could produce. He also, without entirely deciding to, began talking to the voice. It had no name yet, he refused to give it one. The way you don't name a stray you don't intend to keep. But it had a personality by now, sharp and clipped, and entirely without his own doubt in it. It spoke mostly in chess. Force, tempo, initiative. Where his own thoughts spiraled and second-guessed, the voice simply calculated, calm as a machine. And increasingly Daniel found himself reaching for it the way you reach for a light switch in a dark room, without thinking about whether the house was actually yours. He told himself it was a tool. A part of his own mind he was, at last, learning to use on purpose. The cold tactical self he'd suppressed for 11 years, finally being given permission to speak. That was the generous reading. He preferred the generous reading. He did not tell the bishop about the voice. He was not entirely sure why, except that some instinct older than strategy told him the bishop would be very interested, and that being interesting to the bishop had a cost Daniel wasn't ready to name. Chapter 8. Opening moves. At night the calculations didn't stop when he closed his laptop. He'd lie in the dark and see the board behind his eyes, Rourke's pieces, his own, and beneath them, fainter, another board he could never quite bring into focus, his father's face across a kitchen table 11 years ago, saying, "I won't sign it. Daniel, I don't care what he's offering," and Daniel, 17 and furious, and certain his father was choosing principle over his own son's future, had said, something he'd spent over a decade trying to unsay. "Some boards you can't reset," the voice said, almost gently, almost like it understood something Daniel hadn't said out loud. "But you can win the next one badly enough that it stops mattering who lost the last." That, Daniel thought, staring at his ceiling, was either the wisest thing anyone had ever said to him or the most dangerous, and he was becoming less and less sure he could tell those apart anymore either. Chapter 9. The voice. His sister called on a Tuesday, which was unusual enough that Daniel almost didn't answer. "You sound different," Mara said, 20 minutes into a conversation about nothing. "Sharper." "Is that a good thing?" "I've been playing again," he said, which was true, and also the smallest possible fraction of the truth. Dad would have liked that. A pause that both of them let sit, because neither of them fully believed it, and both of them wanted to. "You okay, Danny? Really?" He almost told her. It rose in his throat, unfamiliar and heavy, the bishop, the con, the files, the fire, the voice that had started finishing his sentences in his own head before he'd fully thought them. He opened his mouth. "Say nothing that can't be taken back," the voice said, instantly, flatly, before he'd even chosen a word. "She can't help. She can only become a liability." "I'm fine," Daniel heard himself say. "Just busy." After he hung up, he sat very still for a long time, replaying it, not the conversation, but the half-second before he'd spoken, the half-second where something other than his own hesitation had reached in and made the choice for him. He tried to remember if that had happened before. He realized, with a cold drop in his stomach, that he could no longer be certain how many times it had. He went to the bathroom mirror, which felt stupid even as he did it, some instinct from every psychological thriller he'd ever half-watched at 2 a.m. Check the mirror, see if it's really you. It was really him. Tired eyes, 3 days of stubble, a face that had gotten good at being unreadable to everyone including, apparently himself. "Who are you?" he said to the mirror, quietly, feeling like an idiot. Feeling also like this was the first honest question he'd asked all week. Chapter 10. The voice. The answer didn't come in words. It came the way it always came now, as certainty, as calculation already finished, as the sense of a move being made before he'd consciously decided to make it. He understood, standing there, that the voice was not going to introduce itself. It was going to keep being useful, and being right, and being calm when he was not, until the difference between his own mind and whatever this was stopped being a question he thought to ask. That, he realized, was the actual danger. Not the bishop's con. Not Rourke's money or Rourke's men. The quiet, competent, endlessly reasonable voice that only ever told him things that were true, and only ever asked, in exchange, for a little more of the wheel. Chapter 11. Sacrifice. The charity tournament filled a ballroom with men who'd bought their seats the way they bought everything to be seen buying it. Daniel moved through the room in a rented tuxedo that fit like it had been made for him, because the bishop's tailor had, in fact, made it for him, down to the inside pocket size precisely for a device Daniel had been told not to look at too closely, and had, of course, looked at closely exactly once. Rourke found him near the bar, already flushed with the particular confidence of a man playing on his own turf. "Voss! Good! I requested you at my table." "Hope that's not presumptuous." "It's flattering," Daniel said, and meant, several floors beneath the meaning Rourke would hear it, "it's exactly what we needed." The game itself, when it came, was almost beside the point, and that was the strangest part. Daniel had trained for weeks to beat this man, and instead found himself doing something else entirely, playing not to win but to be watched winning, to let Rourke feel the specific, seductive terror of facing someone better and mistake it for respect rather than danger. Every move was a message. I could crush you and choose not to. Every hesitation was theatre. Rourke's collar touch, that old tell, fired twice in the first 15 moves. Around move 20, Daniel saw it a real sacrifice, not a stagecraft one, a queen offered up for a mating net 4 moves out that Rourke would almost certainly not see coming. It was beautiful. It was also completely unnecessary to the actual job, which required nothing from Daniel but time and proximity, while a piece of software he wasn't supposed to think about did its quiet work in Rourke's coat pocket. "Take it," the voice said, low and certain. "He'll never see the net. It's clean. It's yours." "That's not the job," Daniel murmured, barely moving his lips. "The job is cover. A great game is better cover than a good one. Take it." Chapter 12. Sacrifice. He took it. Watching his own hand lift the queen felt, for one disorienting second, like watching someone else's hand, competent, sure, entirely unbothered by the small voice of his own better judgment, saying this isn't about winning. This was never about winning. Why does it feel like it's about winning now? 4 moves later, Rourke's king had nowhere to go, and the ballroom around their table had gone quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet for something real. Rourke sat back, stared at the board, and, astonishingly, laughed, delighted rather than humiliated, exactly the way a man laughs when he has decided, against all evidence, that being beaten by you is itself an honor. "Play again next month," Rourke said. "My table. Every month. I mean it." Across the room, near the doors, the bishop caught Daniel's eye for exactly 1 second and gave the smallest possible nod. The device had done its work. The job was, technically, done. Daniel smiled, shook Rourke's hand, said all the right things, and felt, underneath the performance, a small, cold recognition he didn't want to look at directly. He had wanted that sacrifice. Not for the job. For himself. For the win. And he was no longer entirely sure the voice had talked him into it, or if it had simply said out loud what he'd already, secretly, decided. Chapter 13. Paranoia. The files didn't come. A week passed, then 10 days, and the bishop went quiet in a way that felt different from his usual choreographed absences, not a pause in the performance, but a door closing somewhere Daniel couldn't see. Calls went to a number that no longer existed. The parking garage sat empty at the hour they'd always met, Daniel started noticing things he told himself he was imagining. A car outside his apartment that he'd seen twice in 2 days, which meant nothing, except that he counted, and it should have meant nothing, and he counted anyway. A barista who asked what he did for a living with just slightly too much interest. His own doorman, greeting him one evening with a warmth that felt, for the first time in 3 years, rehearsed. "You're not imagining it," the voice said the third night, when Daniel lay awake doing what he was starting to recognize as a very familiar, very old ritual, replaying every interaction of the day like a game, looking for the move he'd missed. Rourke doesn't run a business like his without paranoia of his own. If he had you checked out after the tournament, he'd have found things. An investment consultant with your name doesn't exist before 8 months ago. So what do I do? You disappear, or you finish the job before anyone finishes it for you. There's no third option that doesn't end with you in a very deep hole somewhere Mara will spend the rest of her life not finding. The mention of his sister's name did something to Daniel that he couldn't immediately name. A flare of protectiveness, yes, but underneath it, quieter, a flicker of something closer to violation. He hadn't given the voice her name. Not out loud. Not in these conversations. He tried to remember if he'd thought it, at some point, clearly enough that what? That it had heard him think. He sat up in the dark, heart going harder than the thought should have warranted. "How do you know her name?" he said, out loud, to the empty room, and for the first time in weeks, the voice did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and in it Daniel felt something far worse than paranoia, the specific vertigo of realizing that a thing he had trusted, a thing he had let steer, might not be entirely his to trust. When the answer came, it was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You told me, Daniel. You've told me everything. That's rather the point of me." Chapter 14. The mirror. He didn't sleep. At 4 a.m. he did the only thing that had ever actually cleared his head, back before there was a voice offering to do it for him. He set up a physical board, the old one, his father's, wood gone soft and dark at the edges from decades of hands, and he played through a game from memory. Not against an opponent. Against himself, white against black. Both sides his own reasoning, no shortcuts, no whispered certainties. Just him, and the pieces, and the slow, honest work of thinking it through. It was the first time in weeks his head had felt like his own. Halfway through the game he stopped and looked, really looked, at the pattern of his last dozen decisions, not on the board, in his life. The sacrifice he hadn't needed to make. The answer to Mara that had come a half-second too fast to have been his. The way he'd started, without noticing, thinking in the voice's cadence even when the voice wasn't speaking, its certainty bleeding into his own internal monologue until the line between them had gone soft as the edges of the old board. He thought about the bishop's line, weeks ago, in the parking garage. "You're not the first piece I've moved onto this square." And he thought about a technique he'd read about once, years ago, in a very different context, in a support group he'd attended twice after his father died and never gone back to. A facilitator talking about the stories people tell themselves to survive unbearable choices. The parts of the mind that split off and take on their own voice, their own logic, because the whole, undivided self can't carry what's being asked of it. He'd thought it was interesting. He hadn't thought it was about him. Chapter 15. The mirror. He was careful, sitting there in the lamp-lit dark, not to leap to a diagnosis. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't actually know what was happening inside his own skull, and some quiet, stubborn, still intact part of him understood that pretending certainty here would be exactly the kind of trap the rest of this had been. But he could name what he did know. He knew the voice had first arrived the night the bishop reopened a wound Daniel had spent 11 years trying to close. He knew it only ever spoke with total confidence, and total confidence was the one thing Daniel had never once felt about anything since his father's name went into a newspaper as a punchline. He knew that it was very good at telling him what he wanted to hear framed as what he needed to know. And he knew, looking at the board, that whether the voice was something outside him, using his own mind as a door, or something inside him he had built out of 11 years of grief and had finally, disastrously, given the keys to, either way, the fix wasn't going to be a clever move. It was going to be the much harder thing chess had actually taught him underneath all the tactics. Sometimes the strongest move is refusing to move at all until you can see the whole board again. "I need help," he said out loud, to the empty apartment, to the old board, to whatever was or wasn't listening. Not a plan. Help. It was the first sentence in weeks that the voice didn't answer. He decided, sitting there in the quiet that followed, that the silence was the first real evidence he'd gotten that some part of it, at least, was afraid. Chapter 16. Zugzwang. The bishop resurfaced 2 days later, exactly as unbothered as if no silence had happened at all, standing in Daniel's kitchen when Daniel came out of the shower, which was its own kind of message. "You've been slow to answer," the bishop said, pleasant as weather. "You disappeared for 10 days. I was managing complications. Rourke is more careful than his hobbies suggest. It took time to be sure the ledger transfer was clean." The bishop set a slim drive on the counter, black, unlabeled, ordinary, in the specific way that only very dangerous objects manage to be ordinary. "Your father's file is on there. Everything. The forged signature, the second inspector who actually falsified it, the settlement Rourke's lawyers structured to make sure nothing ever traced back to him. You wanted the truth. That's the truth." Daniel looked at the drive and did not reach for it. "I want to know what else is on there," he said. "About me." Something in the bishop's expression moved, very briefly, the first genuinely unrehearsed thing Daniel had ever seen cross that face. "That's an odd question. Is it? You knew things you shouldn't have. You've known things about my sister you shouldn't have. Either I've been careless in a way that isn't like me, or somebody's had a hand on the back of my head this whole time, telling me what to think it was safe to say." Daniel kept his voice level, which cost him more than any move he'd made across a chessboard in a decade. "I want to know what you put in me, and I want to know if it's coming out." The bishop was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Daniel understood, with a cold clarity that felt almost like relief, that he had finally asked a question the man didn't have a rehearsed answer for. Chapter 17. Zugzwang. "You were always going to need something," the bishop said finally, choosing each word like a piece lifted and set down deliberately. "A boy who loses his father, his name, his whole future, in a single season, that boy either breaks, or he builds something to carry the parts of himself he can't carry alone. I didn't put anything in you, Daniel, that grief hadn't already built the room for. I only ever showed it the door. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." The bishop moved toward the door, and for once did not look entirely unbothered doing it. "You're in Zugzwang, Daniel. Every move available to you now makes your position worse. Take the drive and you're implicated in everything on it. Refuse it, and Rourke's people, who by now know exactly who arranged that tournament, come looking for the nearest hand to blame. Trust the voice, and you lose whatever's left of yourself that isn't already mine. Distrust it, and you lose the only thing that's kept you standing for 11 years. So what's the move?" The bishop paused at the door, and for the first time smiled without it looking entirely like a weapon. "The move that isn't on the board yet. You were a prodigy once, Daniel, not because you played the position in front of you. Because you saw the ones nobody had thought to set up." He was gone before Daniel could answer, the way he was always gone. Daniel stood in his kitchen a long time, looking at the drive, and did not touch it. Chapter 18. The Reveal. He didn't go looking for the voice that night. It came anyway, the way it always did, patient and certain and entirely unbothered by the fact that Daniel had spent 2 days deliberately not speaking to it. "You're going to do something reckless," it said. "I can feel the shape of it. You're going to give Rourke the drive yourself, aren't you? Warn him. Undo the whole thing. Maybe. That gets you killed, Daniel. Not metaphorically. Rourke doesn't forgive people who con him, and he especially doesn't forgive people who then confess to it out of some..." He stopped, and Daniel felt, for the first time, something that might have been the voice choosing a word carefully rather than delivering one instantly. Out of some what? Daniel said. Finish it. Out of some need to be the one who tells the truth this time. Because your father told the truth, and it cost him everything, and some part of you has spent 11 years needing to prove that was worth it. That the truth is still worth telling even when it burns you. Daniel sat with that in the dark for a long moment, and felt something shift, not the vertigo of before, but something steadier, almost like recognition. That's not tactics, he said slowly. That's not you protecting the job or protecting me from Rourke's men. That's... You actually know what this is about. I know everything you know. I've told you that from the start. Chapter 19. The Reveal. No. You've told me what I needed to hear to keep moving. This is the first time you've told me what I'm actually afraid of. Daniel stood, walked to the window, looked out at a city that had never once cared what happened on its 64 relevant squares. You're not some separate thing that got into my head, are you? You're the part of me that never stopped being 17 years old at that kitchen table, watching my father choose principle over me, hating him for it and worshipping him for it in the same breath. You're every calculation I made afterward to make sure nobody could ever put me in that position again. You didn't take over my mind. I built you. I built you to survive something I couldn't survive as just me. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Not withholding. Listening. And you've been so good at your job, Daniel said, quieter now, that I forgot you were a tool and started treating you like a second self. That's not your failure. That's mine. I gave you the wheel because holding it myself hurt too much. I only ever wanted to keep you alive, the voice said, and for the first time it sounded, if a voice built entirely of calculation could sound like anything, almost young. I know, Daniel said. I think it's time I tried doing that myself.